So how does this registration feature work under the hood? Well, this is part of a framework called ASP.NET Identity, which used to be called ASP.NET Membership. But ASP.NET Membership had quite a few number of design issues, and it has gone through a few redesigns over the past few years, and the outcome of all these redesigns is ASP.NET Identity. If you look at the references of our project, you see three assemblies that start with Microsoft.ASP.NET.Identity. These assemblies represent ASP.NET Identity Framework. Now, in terms of architecture, ASP.NET Identity has a number of domain classes like Identity User and Role, and it provides a simple API to work with these classes. The API consists of classes like User Manager, Role Manager, Sign-in Manager, and so on. These classes internally talk to another group of classes like User Store and Role Store, which represent the persistent store for ASP.NET Identity. Now, ASP.NET Identity provides an implementation of this persistent store using Entity Framework and a relational SQL database. But you can also plug in your own implementation of a persistent store, like a NoSQL data store. Now, if you remember, the very first time we created a migration, we got all these tables in our migration, like ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET user roles, ASP.NET users, and so on. These tables are generated based on the domain model of ASP.NET Identity Framework. So if we go to our models folder and look at identity models, you see we have application user, which derives from identity user, and we also have application DB context, which derives from identity DB context. Both these classes, identity user and identity DB context, are part of ASP.NET Identity Framework. And that's why the first time we created a migration, we got these tables as part of our migration. Now let me show you something. In controllers folder, account controller. This controller exposes a number of actions like register, login, log off, and so on. Let's take a look at the register action. So we have two register actions, one without a parameter, which is used for loading the registration form. So here we're simply returning the view. And as you might guess, in Solution Explorer, if you go to Views, Account, we've got a bunch of views that are used by our account controller. Now back here, here's the other register action, which is called when we post a form. Let's take a look at the logic here. So if model state is valid, we create a new application user and initialize its username and email properties. Next, we call the create async method of user manager. This is an asynchronous method. That's why we have this async keyword in the method name. And for that, we have to await it. Now, if this doesn't make sense to you, check out my C# advanced course on Udemy. So this user manager is part of the API that we use to work with users. It has methods for creating a user, getting a user, removing a user, and so on. Now, if the call to create async method is successful, we use another manager, sign-in manager, which is responsible for operations like sign in, sign out, and so on. So we call sign-in async. And because of this line here, when I registered, I was logged in automatically. If you don't want this behavior in your application, you can comment out this line and use this sample code below. With this, you can send a confirmation email to the user so they can verify their email address. So this is ASP.NET Identity in a nutshell. Next, I'm going to show you how to disable anonymous access in our application.